something like, 8% of the US population as of March 2017 lives under some form of local drone regulations.
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 108. Ever wonder what's happening at the local and state levels regarding drones? Holland Michel is the founder and editor of the Center for the Study of the Drone at Bard College. The center examines the novel and complex opportunities and challenges presented by unmanned systems technologies in both the military and civilian sphere. As a freelance writer and editor based in New York City, Arthur has written about unmanned systems, mechanical autonomy, and surveillance. Prior to forming the Center for the Study of the Drone, from 2009 to 2012, he was the director of the Tambo Foundation, a community nonprofit that develops sustainable projects in education, infrastructure, potable water, and health in the Cusco region of southern Peru. Recently, the center completed a 3-part study on drone use and regulations at the local level in the United States. The Drone at Home study examines local regulations, public safety use of drones, and drone incidents. Arthur is here to talk about the Center for the Study of the Drone, an interesting class on the drone revolution, and the findings of the Drone at Home series. Now, before we hear from Arthur, thanks again for all of those who have donated to my campaign on patreon.com. You can join this effort and get some cool stuff by going to patreon.com/drone radio show. And now let's learn about what's happening at the local level on the use of drones with Holland Michel. Let's pick up the interview where I ask Arthur to introduce himself.
My name's Holland Michel. I am the co-director of the Center for the Study of the Drone at Bard College.
Arthur, tell us about the center and its work.
The Center for the Study of the Drone is a research and education initiative that I founded along with a colleague at Bard College in 2012. The idea is really to try and help the wide range of stakeholders that are involved in the world of drones better address some of the challenges and opportunities that go along with the development, evolution, and proliferation of unmanned systems technology. We look at unmanned systems both in the civilian commercial sphere and in the military sphere. And not only do we look at drones that fly, we also look at unmanned ground vehicles, robots, and unmanned maritime systems.
Can you give us the backstory on why the center was created?
Back in 2012, if you remember, there were a few things happening that seemed to indicate the world of drones was going to become more expansive and more complex in the coming years. The FAA had just been issued instructions from Congress saying that it needed to integrate drones into the U.S. National Airspace System. Meanwhile, in the military, the use of drones was expanding rapidly. Drone strikes were becoming increasingly common. And we just felt that an inquiry-driven, nonpartisan approach to the issue, some kind of institution that would be able to provide reliable research that everyone could agree upon and that everyone could make use of, would be a valuable contribution to the discussion at large. And so that's what we've been doing for about 4.5 years now. And we produce research reports, sort of like a think tank. We maintain a network of experts and researchers. And we also have an academic educational presence on the campus of Bard College, which is in upstate New York. We teach classes, we have student researchers, we do events, that sort of thing.
Now, related to drones, what type of classes are taught?
Generally it's on the sort of policy, regulatory side of the issue. We have in the past designed a class that was in the computer science department. There is one class in particular that we teach each year, which is called the Drone Revolutions, in which students sort of asked to grapple with the question, what does it mean to say that we're experiencing a drone revolution, and what is the best way to address that drone revolution? So it's more on that side of things. We're not like some of the other university programs out there that are teaching students to actually fly drones or build drones of their own. It's more a sort of humanities-based approach to looking at the issue.
Backing up to your question that you posed about the drone revolution, what type of responses were students giving you?
It's actually fascinating. We really have a broad spectrum of students in our classes each year. At the beginning of each semester that we teach the class, I ask the students, why have you come to the class? What are you hoping to get out of it? And every student comes to it for a different reason, which I think speaks to the variety of ways that drones are impacting everyday life. So we may have economics student who is interested in the drone industry and how it's growing and evolving and developing. We've had theater students who are interested in the interesting ways that drones are being used by a number of dance groups in performances, for example. We've had students who are history majors who are interested in the military use of drones, students who come out of Bard's human rights program who are interested in some of the legal questions. And a function of that diversity of perspectives among the students is that there's never any consensus among the students as to whether we are indeed witnessing one or many drone revolutions. There are those students who say that this is completely transformative and that this technology changes the game completely. And there are other students who are a little bit more nonplussed about the issue, who really do think that this is sort of business as usual, that perhaps some hype that goes along with the discussion around drones that inflates our sense of what they might be capable of and all the ways in which they impact our lives. And so in the discussions in that class, they're great because we always have a real diversity of opinions. I should note, and we don't tell this to the students at the beginning of the class, but the sort of thesis of the class is that asking the question itself, are we witnessing a drone revolution, is not one that has one simple, clear answer. It's a question that merely leads you to really try and contemplate the impact of drones in an analytical way. And by doing that, you consider all sorts of somewhat more nitty-gritty considerations, like, we talk about drone delivery as something that will bring untold efficiency to our lives. But, if you really have to get into it, you start recognizing that there is a regulatory dimension, that somewhat gets in the way of that vision, that there are technological limitations. So that's very much the concept with the class. Another thing about the class that I should note that we're very proud of is that we do try and bring the students in on the research process of the center. We try to tie their work and their feedback and input into some of the work that we've done.
Did you get a sense of whether students approached the drone revolution with fear or with wonder?
There wasn't one consistent sort of sentiment among the students, either going into the class or coming out of the class at the end of the semester. The times that we've taught it, some students are really excited and some students are terrified. It's kind of interesting. The first class we ever taught at Bard was back in 2013. And one thing that I can say categorically that has changed is that the students have a much greater familiarity with the technology now than they did even 4 years ago when we first started doing some of these classes. Back then, 2013 in what I call drone years is like a century ago. The students were really sort of suspicious of the technology. They had lots of questions. They didn't really understand how it worked. I remember bringing a drone into the class and simply having to give the students a basic tech literacy lesson because it really was such a novel technology to them. Nowadays, the students have a much more sophisticated understanding of the technology. They keep up to date with the news about drones. Drones are in the news all the time. And so, they come to the class already knowing quite a lot about drones, I think, purely by being consumers of popular media. They see drones in TV shows and in movies. They hear about drones in the news. So the level of familiarity has gone up, but there is still that spread of students who are excited through to students who are, shall we say, less than excited. There was a student who sat next to me. We do it in this semester, we did it in a sort of round table format. And this really interesting student who sat next to me, whose perspective was that, we've lost privacy, that drones are only going to make it worse, that police departments should not be using drones under any circumstances. And then literally 2 feet from her across the table were students who were actually very intrigued by some of these applications, that really wanted to see the industry expand and grow, and felt that there was all sorts of potential there that was untapped. And so it was really interesting to see when those two perspectives interacted. I will say, always respectfully, the students at BART are absolutely phenomenal.
So let's talk about the recent research by the center, most notably the Drone at Home series. Can you tell us about this research?
We came up with the idea in the fall of 2016 to look at a number of what we saw as being the most pressing and at the same time complex challenges that drones were posing at the local level within the US. And so the way we formulated it is we split the project into 3 parts, largely based on our sense of what sort of things were not only just emerging with the greatest frequency, but also were creating the most ambiguity for policymakers. So the first part of the project explored what appears to be a growing trend in the adoption of ordinances by local authorities around the country that restrict the use of drones in some way or another that generally goes beyond the restrictions imposed by the Federal Aviation Administration. The idea being that, we saw that localities around the country were trying to take the issue of drone integration into their own hands. And we saw that there were some legal concerns that went along with that. The second dimension of the project that we attacked was the growing use of drones among public safety agencies, and in particular law enforcement agencies. This is something where, as with so much that happens in the world of drones, you have all sorts of interesting opportunities emerging as a result of the adoption of this technology. But at the same time, you have some sticky legal questions, some ethics questions that are raised by the population at large. And what we really wanted to do with that element was just to quantify the extent to which drones were being used in the country for law enforcement. And then the third prong to the project was just a bit of a survey of the types of incidents involving drones in the US in the last few years that have resulted in some form of legal action. One of the questions that people often have about drones is, well, how do you enforce the rules? given the newness of the technology, the expansiveness of the airspace, and the limited resources of the Federal Aviation Administration. We wanted to look at actually what happens when the rubber hits the road in the US in terms of how incidents are actually prosecuted. And so for that project, we analyzed about 30 incidents from around the country. So we hoped that in putting out this project, it would give a range of resources to people who are concerned about or excited about or involved in the use of drones at the local level. And so that project came out in the spring of this year, and the response has been really great. It has been picked up fairly widely, and it seems like stakeholders are using it the way we had hoped.
How did the idea to undertake this study come about?
Kind of interesting. One of the sort of flashpoints of inspiration for the project is actually way back in April of 2016, I was presenting at a press conference in Rhode Island with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who was looking to create some legislation that criminalized the use of drones nationally around airports, because he was very concerned about the potential threat posed by drones to manned aviation. And so I attended that event to present some of the center's research on close encounters between drones and manned aircraft. But in attendance were a number of local policymakers, planners, and law enforcement agents. And they were all talking about how they had noticed a bit of a spike in drone use in their local communities in Rhode Island, and that they really needed to do something about it. And what occurred to me as I was watching this conversation unfold is that this was a conversation that was effectively probably happening in city councils and in planning committees and in sheriff's offices around the country. I mean, every time that a sheriff has to deal with some type of nefarious or not nefarious drone use in the community, he or she is probably going to sit down with some of their peers and have a conversation about it. And some of those conversations have policy implications because they lead to ordinances. And so watching that conversation, I did sort of have that flash. And what it really struck me in the same moment that I had that idea was that if indeed these conversations were happening around the country, that was going to pose an enormous challenge to the federal integration efforts, because the FAA by that point had already made clear that it was not in support of local authorities controlling their airspace, that it felt that the safe and comprehensive integration of drones in the U.S. airspace really hinged on the Federal Aviation Administration's ability to maintain strict sole authority over a single unified national airspace system. And so looking at that, we just knew that this was going to be a tremendous issue that raised all sorts of interesting questions. So that was a little bit of the seed with that.
Let's talk about the findings of the 3 studies. We don't have to go into a lot of details since the studies are available on the center's website. But starting with the local regulations, what are some of the key highlights that you discovered?
We found that about 130 localities around the country have adopted, as of March 2017, some form of local drone ordinance. These localities altogether are home to over 30 million people. So something like, 8% of the US population as of March 2017 lives under some form of local drone regulations. These rules generally addressed a range of fairly common concerns around the use of drones I should note that the vast majority of these ordinances addressed private drone use. So they are not intended to regulate the use of drones by civil authorities, such as local or state law enforcement agencies or public safety agencies. Some of the things that are restricted by these ordinances, use of drones over public space or public properties is a very, very common one. About half of all ordinances impose some restriction over the use of drones over public property, whether it's the use of drones over public parks, the use of drones over government buildings, the use of drones over beaches, or a combination of those. In other cases, there are ordinances that restrict the use of drones over roads, which was not something that we were strictly aware of before we embarked on this research project. Another common set of restrictions were geared towards protecting privacy. You had ordinances in a number of cities that restricted the use of drones, for example, over private property. That was a common one. I think something like about a quarter of ordinances had some restriction on the use of drones over private property. Another common restriction that is geared towards privacy is banning the use of drones to conduct surveillance in any way or to record a person in the community without their direct consent. And then some of the slightly less common, but at the same time still, fairly widespread restrictions had to do with things like not operating the drone while intoxicated. That was a fairly common one. Or a few others actually require local drone operators to obtain some form of local permission to operate drones. I should note that a lot of these ordinances are a sort of mix and match, sort of a mishmash of these different types of rules. And so you may have one ordinance that bans use of drones over private property, but doesn't ban the use of drones over public property. You may have an ordinance that does not ban the use of drones over private property, but restricts the use of drones for data collection. So it's a fairly complex landscape.
How is enforcement handled?
A large number of these ordinances actually define punishments for violations, everything from, misdemeanor charge, or just sort of simple violation charges, through to fines, some of which are very large. The lowest fines we saw were, I think, in the neighborhood of about $50. There were some localities that defined fines of, up to $5,000 or $10,000, depending on the severity of the violation. There was a pretty broad spectrum. And what seemed is that, these ordinances didn't always provide clear definitions of, what type of violation would result in what type of charge, because they usually give some range. You see a fine that says no littering, fines between $250 and $1,000, and you wonder, well, what do I have to do to get the $250 charge as opposed to the $1,000 charge? So that was what we saw. There was also some communities that did define jail time for infractions, usually pretty short, things like, a couple of weeks, but again, not specifying what types of violations from within the ordinance would actually land you behind bars.
Now, there were 130 plus ordinances that were adopted, but did you also find some that are being pursued but not yet officially adopted?
Yeah, we came across dozens of ordinances that appeared to be still under consideration, or in ordinances where the approval process just stalled for whatever reason. The research was largely based on open source reporting, things like news reports and local authorities self-reporting of things like council meeting minutes. So we found dozens of cases where a town council held a meeting to evaluate drone rules or debated an ordinance, drafted an ordinance, and then we found no proof that ordinance had actually been adopted. There were also cases where local governments had adopted ordinances only to retract those ordinances after discovering that they appeared to contravene federal authority. We didn't report on in the report because we really just wanted to give a sense of where the rules exist in the country and what those rules look like, as opposed to pointing a finger at places that, for whatever range of reasons, have considered drones but haven't actually put laws into practice.
As a city planner, I think you did a great job compiling the data into an easy-to-read format. And you provided links to all of the ordinances that makes it helpful. It's a great one-stop research tool on this topic.
I'm glad you feel that way. I really appreciate it. We certainly spent many, many hours reading local news stories and working our way through town council minutes. So I feel like I have a pretty good sense now of how town council meetings generally run and the cast of characters that you often see in these meetings, with the drone entrepreneur standing up and defending his right or her right to operate in the airspace. And then in the span of a few minutes, a local citizen concerned about the privacy of their airspace standing up and offering the exact opposite opinion. So it was definitely an interesting project to work on.
Yep, that's local government at its best.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's move on to the public safety research. Describe that study and what you found.
That project was really intended just to give a sort of sense from a geographical standpoint of where public safety drones are in use around the country. A lot of people have talked over the years about how the use of drones by police and other public safety agencies has drastically expanded, but no one could really put a number behind that. Now we have a number that we can work on. Though I should note, and this goes not only for the Public Safety Drones Project, but also for the local drone rules project and the drone incidents project, is that the data becomes pretty outdated pretty quickly. In the weeks, literally, since those reports have come out, I've seen numerous cases of new localities adopting rules, and I've seen numerous dozens, I'd even say, cases of public safety agencies acquiring drones. So this data is current as of the spring of 2017. In the case of the public safety drones, we found 347 state and local agencies. But now in June of 2017, I wouldn't be surprised if the number was more like 360 or 370. The majority of those agencies that we found were law enforcement, either police departments or sheriff's offices. And then a smaller but not insignificant number were fire departments and city or county government agencies that, and this is important, that when acquiring the drone listed some public safety applications as intended uses. So we have not included the cities that have adopted drones solely for the purpose of mapping landfill sites. It's only cities that have said going to be using the drone to map landfill sites, but also to chase down criminals or to help in search and rescue operations. The local ordinance project, the local rules project, when I talk about the 130 local authorities, there we're only talking about sub-state, so municipalities and cities and towns. That project, we do give a bit of a roundup of the 30 or so states that have adopted drone legislation too. But in the public safety drones case, we looked at both local and state agencies. We found that there were actually 18 statewide public safety agencies around the country that have adopted drones for one reason or another. One of the other interesting, though not entirely surprising findings is that the rate of acquisition has accelerated tremendously over the years. In 2015, only about 80 law enforcement agencies or public safety departments acquired drones. In 2016, it was double that effectively, over 160.
How did you compile the data for the report?
It was totally brute force. It was pounding the virtual pavement, reading local news reports, town council and municipal minutes, and also the very tedious job of actually mining contract announcements, which was sort of similar to the local ordinances in that we always had to fact check any findings because a local newspaper may report that a police department's obtaining a drone, but if we find no other proof of that, no mention at all, then we have to regard that finding with a bit of skepticism. So it was really a way to not only ensure that we were covering as many of our bases as possible, but actually also to ensure the results were highly reliable. One of the other findings that, again, was interesting, though not altogether flabbergasting, was that DJI has total dominance in this sector, as it does in so many other sectors. The Phantom is actually by far and away the most popular unmanned aircraft adopted by public safety agencies, and the DJI Inspire is the second most popular. Those together account for probably about 3/4 of the total number of drones that are operated by public safety agencies. I should also note that we found a number of agencies that operate multiple drones. So just because we found 347 agencies doesn't mean there's 347 drones in operation. There are a number of departments that own 2 or more systems. Sometimes they own 2 of the same, but other times it's a bit of a diversity.
Did you find any interesting geographical distribution?
Whenever we do a data project like this, we input the data into a map program, and often it looks fairly interesting until you compare the heat map to a population heat map. And you see that generally the sort of higher density population areas have more action. You know, we didn't find any real outliers that jumped out to us in terms of the geographical distribution, but I'm sure we could at some point in the future look at the issue a little more closely, and we may find that, you know, there are 4 public safety agencies all within a very small and sparsely populated region that operate drones, and that might be something to have a closer look at. But we hope that that's the sort of thing that people can do with the data that we provide, because, you know, again, with this report, we provide a list of every single law enforcement agency around and public safety agency around the country that operates drones. So we really do hope that it is used as a bit of a lever for further research. And we're really excited when people do that. That's exactly the point of what we do. We try and provide a bit of a seed and then see what sort of creative things people do with it.
And lastly, tell us about the local incident study. Now, previously, the center conducted a study of small UAS close calls near airports based on FAA data. But this study goes further, as I understand it.
We wanted to open the aperture a little bit with this project and not only look at close encounter incidents, but try and get a sense of the range of different types of incidents involving drones that result in legal action. I should say from the outset, this is not intended to be an entirely comprehensive list of every single incident involving drones in the U.S. that has resulted in legal action. Unlike the public safety drones project or the local law project, sometimes, very often, it actually seems incidents happen and just sort of slip under the radar. So instead of trying to give an encyclopedic view of how people have been getting into trouble with drones over the years, it's more intended to give you a sort of survey sample sense of the sort of things that people do that gets them in trouble with the law when it comes to drones. And so we divided it into a number of different categories, the sort of things that tend to pop up with the most frequency. One of them was, of course, incidents involving drones interfering with the manned airspace system. We looked at privacy intrusion incidents, sort of peeping Tom cases. We looked at incidents where drones have crashed in some way that endangers public safety. We looked at incidents where drones have been used to smuggle contraband into prisons. And finally, we also looked at cases where drones were being used where they're not allowed to be used. So in places like national parks, which banned the use of drones nationwide a couple of years ago, or at big public events, or localities that ban the use of drones through local ordinances.
What do the numbers tell us?
So we looked at 30 incidents with a fairly even split among the different categories. Within each category, we didn't just want to offer one incident as sort of proof of generalized takeaways about, how those incidents are generally handled. There are sort of 4 or 5 incidents per category. We feel like that gives a fairly good sort of cross-section of the type of incidents that are out there. And certainly we tried with that project to cover the most high-profile ones. Another thing I should note, one of the filters that we placed on this was that we only looked at cases where there was some kind of legal follow-up. There have been many more cases where a drone has been used, crashed into a parade, and the drone operator apologized profusely for it. No one pressed charges, and that was sort of the end of story. We didn't look at cases like that because really the idea here is to look at what happens when the rules are actually enforced. The main takeaway is that at this point in time, there seems to be some lack of consistency in terms of how incidents are prosecuted, not only across categories, but within categories too. For example, we even found that the national parks don't always enforce their ban on drone use consistently across cases. It's a bit like that no littering sign that says fines between $250 and $1,000, and you sort of wonder, well, what do I have to do to get the $250 fine as opposed to the $1,000 fine? So in the case of the national parks incidents, people got a couple of days of community service for an incident, and some people got, a few $1,000s of fines for using a drone. Same goes for drone crashes. There are even a couple of crashes in Manhattan, for example, where there wasn't consistency in the level of the fines that people received. So that was the sort of main takeaway from that project. It really seems that we're still on that sort of integration curve where law enforcement authorities are still figuring out how best to enforce the rules. The FAA is still figuring out on how to best offer guidance to local authorities on enforcing the rules. I should note again that this being a drones at home project, a local drone project, we weren't looking at FAA enforcement actions. Those are very well recorded, and there have been quite a few of them. What we were looking at in this case was when non-FAA authorities, generally local authorities, but there are a few state authorities and district attorney's offices that prosecute the cases, because that's where the real enforcement actually happens. So that was the sort of main takeaway. We see that changing as the rules get clearer and as the adoption curve continues to chart its predicted course. But at this point in time, it seems to be the case is that, if you're operating a drone in one place and you crash into some building, and you operate a drone in another place and you crash into something, all else being equal, you may still get an entirely different result out of that. And again, it's a little hard to read into why that is. I think it's not entirely because, there is somewhat of a lack of clarity as to what the rules are from a law enforcement standpoint, and a lack of clarity as to how to enforce rules. It's also because every case is different, and the FAA has not issued strict guidelines to local law enforcement as to how to enforce the rules. It has generally said, it's up to you. These are the rules as they stand. Try and be consistent and fair, but different people have a different sense of what that means.
Can the findings of these studies tell us anything about the overall drone industry?
It's a little bit hard, to read hard and fast conclusions into what this all means for the drone industry. I should add a caveat to that. It's hard to read specific implications. General implications are that there is still such a long way to go on the integration curve. I'll give you a good example. With local ordinances, the FAA has issued a guidance to local authorities that are considering adopting their own local drone rules. And it has said that it will take action, and it has grounds to take action against certain types of ordinances, but not others. Others it is very happy to go along with. The types of ordinances it says that it would take issue with are the ones that directly control the airspace. So an ordinance that says this area is a no drone zone, ordinances that place sort of physical airspace limitations or requirements on drone operators in the area. That's the stuff that the Federal Aviation Administration says, no, we won't abide that. But they say in the same breath, there are a number of rules that they can completely stand behind, that local authorities are entirely free to adopt. And these rules generally are those that relate to how drones are being used, what they're being used for. So local authorities, in the eyes of the FAA, are entirely free to adopt rules, as the FAA puts it, to, for example, protect privacy. Right? Now, that all seems fairly clear until you wonder what the actual bright line is between restrictions on airspace and restrictions on how drones are used. Because you could say we are protecting our citizens' privacy from rogue drone use by banning drones in our airspace. And the FAA has not yet come out and given a, clear sense as to where it falls on that bright line, how it would adjudicate those types of cases. What we also don't know, which sort of adds to the ambiguity, is if a very large local authority, for example, were to adopt a really restrictive local ordinance and decided to really stand by it, what mechanisms would the FAA have to actually take action on that? Would there be a court case? We think that it's entirely plausible that there could be legal challenges that arise out of these types of local ordinances. But what would that court case look like? We think it would be a court case that is very much unprecedented and would raise all sorts of questions to do with how you define what counts as a rule that falls under local authority versus a rule that falls under federal authority. So I'm not going to be surprised if in a couple of years or tomorrow or in a few months, we see a legal challenge that really calls all of these definitions into question. And cases like that create ambiguity for the drone industry. There's no doubt about it. And so, that's, I think, just one example of how lots of what we've seen with regards to the use of drones locally generates more ambiguity for the drone industry than it does clarity, I think. And so that's something that I think is naturally going to evolve as we continue to move along the integration curve. But as it stands right now, we're just at a one step in what is going to continue to be a very long process.
And as we close, Arthur, what do you hope people will gain by accessing the research compiled by the Center for the Study of the Drone?
What we've observed since the very earliest days of our existence is that not only is the issue of drones, whether it be military drones or civilian drones, is always a very polemical issue. It's always a very divisive issue. And because of that, the stakeholders who work on this issue from the whole range of different angles that they work on it from often talk at cross purposes. There are the privacy advocates that feel like they may stand in opposition to the drone industry, and vice versa, the drone industry that feels that it is working to dispel misconceptions about how drones do and do not affect or impinge upon our privacy. But, what we've always said and what we stand by is that a lot of these groups actually have a lot more in common than they may think. Everyone wants to see a safe airspace system. Everyone wants to see clarity when it comes to the rules. Everyone wants to see truly harmful behavior with drones enforced and prosecuted. So when we put out documents like this, these research reports, our hope is that it can provide a bit of a common ground. We don't have a dog in this fight, so to speak. We're not trying to push a particular agenda when it comes to drones. Our goal is purely that of an educational institution. We just want to educate people. And so as a result, we hope that people can sort of see our intentions or our lack of intentions in our content and trust that content and feel that they can use it as a common ground, where two groups that are debating the pros and cons of how to enforce drone use can look at our local drone incidents report and say, okay, well, this is something that we can all sort of use in common, that this provides a bit of a baseline, that no one's trying to skew the numbers in one way or another. That's really not our goal. So, that I hope is the main takeaway. The main contribution of the center is really just helping to facilitate a discussion that is constructive rather than divisive by providing data that, we hope people can agree upon.
That's it for episode 108 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Arthur Holland Michel of the Center for the Study of the Drone and learning how local governments are responding to the drone revolution. I want to thank Arthur for taking the time to speak with me. If you want to learn more about the center or connect with Arthur, check out their website at dronecenter.bard.edu. You can download the 3 reports as well as much more research at this site. If you like the Drone Radio Show, please consider supporting the podcast with a small donation. The content is always free, but for as little as $1 per month, you can help defray the cost of production. To donate, go to patreon.com/Drone Radio Show. Thanks for listening. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Gores.
This has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.